So I'm Patti Lutsky. I'm a product manager for the Arbortext editor products, and I'm also product manager for the Service Information Manager products. I've been working on Arbortext for over 20 years now, and before the PTC acquisition of Arbortext, my role was primarily with content management integrations and working on the integrations that we had at that time. So for this presentation, my plan is to essentially cover the evolution that we've seen over the years from CMS to digital thread, starting with some of the early capabilities that we had, then showing some of the capabilities that Windchill added into the mix, then Service Information Manager, and now some of the more recent capabilities that we've added related to digital thread. So first off, why CMS? Well, I think many of us have been storing our content in a content management system for quite a while, to the point where we take some of this for granted. But you know, initially some of the capabilities that were provided included things like the ability to see previous versions of the content and to compare compare different versions of your content. The ability to create components from monolithic documents. This was even more true at that point when many of the documents were large DocBook or similar type document types, where we would want to create separate components, say for each of the chapters and each of the sections, what we at Arbortext refer to as bursting. And this really improved the ability for collaboration, because rather than having to reserve or check out an entire book, you could only reserve the chapters or sections that you were working on. Now, of course, these days, many of us are working now with topic-based authoring and document types similar to DITA, where the bursting is more about keeping track of links to graphics rather than necessarily bursting into chapters and sections. But still, reuse is key. It was key at that time and still is. The idea that there may be topics that are relevant for multiple documents, and you only need to author those once and then pull them in where relevant. Also, the ability to do some analysis to find where used, where, you know, if I make a change to a given topic or a given fragment of a topic, how many other places is this being used, and will my change be appropriate for all of those places? And of course, referential integrity, the idea that if a component is being used by documents, you shouldn't be able to delete that component, because that would make those documents invalid. So the CMS enforces referential integrity for the documents and their components. And this, some of you are probably very familiar with, but some of the user interface that we have related to just basic CMS capabilities, the ability to browse through the CMS and see folder structure as well as the document structure. So in the browser you can see what are the subcomponents of a given compound document. The ability to search, both simple and advanced searches, and then the ability to see the metadata in our object properties display. So then the second phase was our integration with Windchill and our, sort of ongoing addition of capabilities that Windchill is providing us. Pretty much right off the bat, we got the ability to work with advanced workflows and lifecycle states where customers can define what's appropriate for their organization. We also got the ability to work with, to create and then work with baselines. And in this check-in dialog box, you can see that right when you do a check-in, you have the opportunity to create a baseline so that it will be a snapshot of that document at that particular point in time. Another capability that Windchill brought was the ability to work offline. You're able, when you are choosing the workspaces to work with, you can request to work offline with a particular workspace. And as you can see in this dialog box on the bottom, you select which workspaces to use offline, and then you're able to disconnect from the server. Any documents that were previously checked out, you can continue to work on. And then later when you reconnect to the server, any of the changes that you've made, you have the opportunity to check those in. You're not able to do checkouts of additional documents since you're offline, and the system wouldn't be able to validate that no one else has checked those out, but you are able to continue working on those documents that you've already checked out. Another capability that Windchill brought was the ability to make deep copies of the compound documents, what's referred to in Windchill as save as. And what's tricky about doing this is that within the XML content, you might have references to your subcomponents, either your graphics or your fragments, or in the case of a map, references to topics. And if on the Windchill side, on the Windchill UI, if you do this save as operation, then the first time that you open the copied object in Arbortext Editor, Arbortext will update all the links in the XML to point to the deep copy of the components. So you will actually get the updates done automatically in the XML, and then you can go forward with that copy and make whatever changes you have planned for the new compound document. Another capability that Windchill added was the ability to have two-way metadata. We had previously had the ability to store XML content into the repository, so you could make a change to the XML, and then when you checked it in, it would store that as metadata on your document. But in Windchill, we also added the ability to have it work both ways. So when you check out a document, if any of the metadata has changed on the Windchill side, those changes will be reflected in your XML content. Then any changes that you might make while you're editing in Arbortext, when you do a check-in, those will be reflected in the repository. And then the last item I have on this list, and this isn't necessarily an exhaustive list, but it covers sort of some of the high points of what was added from Windchill, is the ability to have multiple link types. And what's nice about this is that you're able to identify links that should not have referential integrity assigned to them. So we refer to it as data full versus data partial, although it doesn't necessarily have to be data documents that are using these link types. If you identify that a relationship from the parent document to a child document should be data full, then it'll be the traditional link that we've always used that will enforce referential integrity and will be visible in the CMS browser. But if you identify that link as data partial, or that relationship as data partial, then this is appropriate for something like a cross-reference link, where you want the target of the cross-reference link to exist in the repository, but if it doesn't exist, it's really not broken per se. It's just, it'll be inconvenient for the consumer of the document. And so in that case, we will store it as a reference link in Windchill. You can still see and get a report of all the relationships, and when you publish from Windchill, the related documents will be included. Particularly, this is more relevant, what I'll get to in a minute, with Service Information Manager when you're publishing a bundle. But you're not enforcing that referential integrity, and you're identifying it as a different link type, as more of a reference link rather than a required link. So then the next phase in our evolution had to do with Service Information Manager and our introduction of the Service Information Manager product. And with this, what we've added really is a new way of thinking about the documents and your document content, where rather than always thinking about the document structure, you can organize your content according to your product structure. And the two main concepts that we introduced with Service Information Manager is the information structure and then a publication structure as separate from the information structure. So in the information structure, this would be organized according to your product. So for some customers, they base it directly on the product structure that is already stored in Windchill. And you're able to put the content under the specific groupings that you've identified for the product. If it's a vehicle, things like the transmission versus the brakes versus the engine. And then when you publish this, in particular if you publish it to in-service in what we call as an in-service bundle, then in in-service the end users will also be able to locate the information according to your product structure. So they would be able to find all the information relevant, for instance, to the transmission versus all the information relevant to the brakes. And it would include information about operating or servicing or other related content for that particular area of the product. Now the other thing that it adds that you're able to do is to set what we call applicability. And I have a little more information about applicability coming up, but the general idea is that you might store information about your product and all of its variants. There may, again, in the case of a vehicle, there might be differences between the two-wheel drive versus the four-wheel drive, or the left-hand steering wheel versus right-hand steering wheel, and many other variants. And you're able to include that applicability in the structure so that when the end customer is using in-service, they can specify the specific vehicle they're working on and all of its associated variants. And then what they'll see is the specific information relevant to that vehicle and those variants. Now, on the other hand, the publication structure is more like a traditional document where you are specifically setting up a table of contents for a particular publication. In this case, it might be a service manual, a guide, a parts catalog, or a service bulletin. Now, you can still have applicability in your publication structure, but the idea is that your publication structure is more has a specific audience and is geared to a specific set of information. And so this slide we've used for some time, but it tries to capture the general idea that your information structure is going to have all of the information about your product. And in this case, again, it's showing, you know, a vehicle with a brake system, drivetrain, engine, and then also a maintenance schedule section for some information that maybe isn't directly part of a component of the product, but is an important set of information related to the product. That can be in your information structure also. And then when you create your publication structure, you're pulling in specific pieces of information that you want to have, in this case, in your service manual. So it will only pull in specific service procedures, not all of the service procedures for that vehicle. And similarly, maybe some of the information doesn't need to be included in this publication structure. For instance, if it was not a service manual, it wouldn't be appropriate to include a maintenance schedule in there. And the author can decide the appropriate structure for that publication and then the appropriate content to include in the publication. And then, as I mentioned, applicability is a key feature that service information provides. And then another one is translation management. This dialog shows what the manage applicability options are available to the user. And there's two sections to the dialog. The top one, where it says expressions, that's referring to Windchill options and choices, where you can define options and choice values for a given product and then assign those to the content and you can assign it both to individual pieces of content or to entire groups or sections of content. The other thing you can see about the expressions is that there might be item expressions or usage expressions. So the usage expressions means in this particular structure, this is the appropriate applicability, whereas the item expression is relevant for any structure that this particular piece of content is included in. Then the bottom half of the dialog is showing the service effectivity. And this is similar to traditional Windchill effectivity, except that what we've added is the ability to have date effectivity, serial number effectivity, or it could be date and serial number effectivity. And then the context of that effectivity would be one of the nodes in what we refer to as the product hierarchy. So you're identifying which piece of the product is this relevant to, and then which specific serial numbers is it relevant, or which specific dates. You know, it's relevant from 2017 to the end of 2018 or something along those lines. And so in this specific example, it's showing a serial number effectivity. And then the other key component that we added, or that Service Information Manager adds as far as content management is concerned, is translation management, where you're able to create translation packages that contain exactly what needs to be translated And then there are also dashboards that give you information about what has already been translated, what is remaining to be translated. And I specifically am not going to go into a lot of detail on this topic today because I'm scheduled to give another webinar on translation management. I believe it's at the end of May. So I'll go into a lot more detail about that topic at that time. But I just wanted to mention it as an important capability of Service Information Manager. So now the latest evolution that we've had is related to the digital thread. And at a high level, what digital thread is referring to is just managing changes throughout the life cycle of the product. The idea that you want your service content and your other content related and tied to the engineering data. And if there is a change made to the engineering data, that information should be available to be to the service writer, and so those changes will be pushed down into the service content as well. And as it says, it's all intertwined, the idea that the different pieces can impact each other. So there are three specific capabilities that I'll go over today related to digital thread. And these are capabilities that we've added into Service Information Manager related to digital thread. One of the capabilities will be the ability for a user to create explicit links between the service documents and the engineering data. And I'll show some of the capabilities related to that. The second one has to do with including some pre-existing content in the bundle output that is then available for in-service for the end user to see. And again, I'll go into that in a minute. And then the last capability has to do with XML content being able to directly reference parts that are stored in Windchill. So if you have your engineering assemblies in Windchill, within your XML content, you can directly reference those Windchill parts. Okay, so let's start with the first one. The first one has to do with explicit links. And what we've added in Service Information Manager is this Impacted By tab, which is available on both an information structure and a publication structure. And what you're able to do is add specific parts that are relevant to the particular section of the structure. Now in this screenshot, it's showing something relevant to the entire structure, but it could be something specific to one of the groups in your information structure or one of the sections in your information structure. So the idea is that you as a service content writer are saying, I know that this four-wheel drive loader is relevant to a particular part. Now, unfortunately, in this screenshot, it doesn't have the best name, but presumably the name of that part would be something more like the four-wheel drive wheel loader assembly, the top-level assembly for that wheel loader. And once you've set up those associations, you can also set up notifications so that if a change happens to that part that you've identified, you can get a notification whenever that change happens. And so that you as a content writer would know, oh, something changed, I should go find out what changed and figure out what, if anything, needs to change in the service content. The other thing that you can get is a listing of all of the content for a given structure where the related part, that part that you've set up that impacted by relationship on, where that part changed. So in this case, what we're seeing is a given part changed, and we've got the high-level structure was linked to that part, and then these two specific documents were also linked to that part. And so the idea is, or linked to a part. So the idea is that, okay, something changed on the engineering side, and I can get a specific listing of what on the service side, what of the service content should I look into to make sure whether or not I need to make a change related to that. And then the other side of this is on the part itself. So on the part itself, you can bring up what we call the impact analysis report. And what this will do is it will show you the service objects that might be impacted. So the idea here is that if I'm an engineer and I'm going to make a change to something, I can see, well, where are all the places that a content author has identified might need to change related to this. And it can give, important insight into the scope of the change that you're about to make on the engineering side. So that was the first capability related to digital thread, where we're allowing you to explicitly link the engineering content to the engineering data to the service content. This is the second one. The idea here is that for many Windchill users, they may have some pre-existing documents that they have linked to parts that they want to include in their bundle that gets published to in-service. So if they've got, if you've already got documents, these may be Word documents, they may be other formats that have been associated to a part, and you know that those are, they've been reviewed, they're ready to be published out and available for end users. You don't necessarily have to transform them into XML, transform them into Arbortext documents. What you can do is you can set up what we call a filter, and in that filter identify the exact specifications for those documents that should be included when you publish out the bundle. And then when you publish the bundle for your structure, any part that has a related document that meets the criteria that you set up will in fact be published and included in the bundle and available for your end users. And in particular, the two links that are most often used are either the describe link or the reference link. So on the part, you might have a describing document or a reference document that you'd like to include in your output. And the dialog on the lower right is showing the filters that you can set up, because certainly there may be other documents associated to parts that should not be end user visible. But you can explicitly set things like your configuration spec. So in here you might say only released documents should be included. You could also have an attribute filter. So perhaps you might set up an attribute on these documents that says this document should be user visible or should not be user visible. And in this filter, you would say only those with the attribute with the appropriate values, so it should be user visible. And you also might have a type, if you've defined a specific type for those documents that should be user visible. So since we're talking about publishing out things that already exist, we tried to keep this as flexible as possible, with the idea that different customers probably had different conventions for how they identified documents that would be appropriate to be published to a bundle. And so that's what we presented here. You can really have quite a bit of flexibility in identifying these documents that should be part of your output and then should be visible in service for end users. Then the final part of digital thread that I wanted to show has to do with the ability in your XML content to refer to specific parts that are in Windchill. And the idea here is that in your doc type configuration file, your DCF file, there is a configuration that you can set up that's called Windchill part reference. And as you can see, it's in the specials section of your document type configuration file. And what this Windchill part reference allows you to do is identify a particular element in your document type and a attribute, in this case the ref attribute, that will be, that should be treated special, that should be treated as a link to a part in Windchill. And as you can see, there's a few other, I won't go into all the details of the other things you can specify about Windchill part reference, but you can also identify a particular element or attribute related to what should be the part name or the part number. But I won't go into that today. Now the link, what will happen when you use this is that a link in Windchill will be created between the document and the part. And then also that the information about the part will be included when you publish from Service Information Manager. So again, when you publish to an in-service bundle, you will have this information about the part. And also when you publish to PDF, the information will be available. Of course, you would have to adjust a style sheet to be able to take advantage of it in a PDF environment. Now let me show an example of this. I think it'll be clearer with an example. So on the right here is the what I just showed about what can be in your document configuration file. On the left is showing an XML document or a piece of an XML document. And what you can see here is there is an element, in this case the part no element, which has been configured to be a Windchill part reference. And then the href attribute is using our logical ID format that we've used to refer to document fragments. But in this case, rather than being file equals such and such, it shows part equals and then gives the identifier, the Windchill identifier for the part master. So what you've got now is you're saying, okay, this specific document which is about the operator console, it will have a direct link to the actual part, which is the operator console cover. And what the bottom screenshot shows is in Windchill, when you're looking at the document, you can have a referenced table, which would show any of the parts that has this special relationship to the document. And in this case, again, it's the operator console cover. So this isn't exactly an out-of-the-box capability. It requires a certain amount of configuration. It would certainly, if you're publishing to PDF, it requires style sheet work, but it does provide the general ability to link your service content and your documents to specific parts in Windchill. Again, adding to our ability to keep this digital thread where you've got relationships between the engineering data and the service content. So again, just to review, some of the capabilities that we've added related to digital thread. One being the ability to explicitly link documents, and documents could be also information groups, publication sections, to the parts that they describe. The second one being the ability to include pre-existing documents when you're publishing into a in-service bundle. And again, you can set up the filter that would be appropriate for your organization. And the third capability is the ability to add references to parts right inside your XML documents.